that the word day in the Old Testament, when it appears with a numeral adjective, refers to a day of 24 hours. In other words, every time that the word day appears in the Old Testament,
Literal 24.
and it has a number attached to it, like first day, second day, third day, etc., it refers to a literal day. Now somebody might say, well, Pastor Bohr, what about the periods of time at the end of the book of Daniel where it speaks of 1,260 days, 1,290 days, 1,335 days? We understand those to be symbolic days. Yes, they are symbolic days, but first they're literal, and then you apply the year-day principle to those days.
Yes.
Amen.
But they're literal, 24-hour days, but then you apply the prophetic principle that one day is equivalent to a year. They're
Yes.
still literal days.
Right.
There's no exceptions to this in the Old Testament. Every time the word day appears with a numeral qualifier, it refers to a day of 24 hours. Another evidence that the days of creation were literal days is the expression evening and morning. It would be ridiculous to say, and it was the evening and morning of the first 1,000,000 years. Evening and morning is marked by the rising and the setting of the sun.
That's right.
So the expression evening and morning indicates that the days of creation were literal 24-hour days. Also in Psalm 33 and verse 9, we have the language of immediacy when it comes to creation. It tells us there that God spoke and it was done.
Amen.
Commanded.
He commanded
Stood fast.
and it stood fast. That is a language of quickness. He speaks and it's done.
Right.
Another interesting expression that we find 4 times in the creation story that indicates that the days of creation were literal days is the expression, and it was so. In other words, God makes something and says, and it was so. Once again, it gives the impression of something that is done quickly. This is where God speaks, and it was so.
Yes.
Probably the greatest evidence that the days of creation were literal days is the 4th commandment. Because God tells us that we are to work 6 and rest the 7th like He worked 6 and rested the 7th. Now, if the days of creation were millions of years long, we couldn't follow God's example.
That's right.
Are you following me?
Yes.
Another evidence is that the New Testament writers believe that the story of creation is literal. Not symbolic, not millions of years. For example, in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 6, Jesus said, He who made them in the beginning made them male and female. And then He pronounced them, even though they were 2, one flesh.
Yes.
What God has joined together, let not man
Asunder.
cast asunder. Jesus in the New Testament believed that the story of Adam and Eve, of creation, was literal.
Yeah.
That they were created up front,
That's right.
male and female.
Yes, sir.
Ellen White also, this is another evidence, Ellen White makes it explicit that the days of creation were literal. I want to read just a couple of statements here. The first is from Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 85. Where Ellen White wrote, I was then carried back to the creation. This is happening in vision.
Yes.
And was shown that the first week in which God performed the work of creation in 6 days and rested on the 7th day was just like every other week.
Oh, my Lord.
Amen.
The great God, in His days of creation and day of rest, measured off the first cycle as a sample for successive weeks
Yes.
till the close of time.
Mercy.
Amen.
You couldn't be any clearer.
Good stuff.
In another statement, Testimonies to Ministers, page 135, she wrote, when the Lord declares that He made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, He means the day of 24 hours, which He has marked off by the rising and setting of the sun.
Solid.
Now, what part of that don't you understand? Very clear.
Clear as crystal.
So we have all of these evidences. Furthermore, and this I leave till last because, you know, it's the least authoritative source, what others say. Seventh-day Adventist Church is not the only church in the world that believes that the days of creation were literal. There are scholars from other churches that believe the same. For example, one of them is Henry Morris. Staunch creationist. He wrote a book titled Biblical Creationism. He was actually a scientist. Creationist scientist. And he wrote the following words in his book, Biblical Creationism, page 62. The Lord Himself had worked 6 days, then rested on the 7th, setting thereby a permanent pattern for the benefit of mankind.
Mercy. Wow.
So what evidences do we have? The Hebrew lexicons tell us that the days of creation were literal days. No exception. When the word day is attached to a numeral adjective, it means a day of 24 hours. No exceptions in the Old Testament. The expression evening and morning indicates that they were literal days.
Yes.
The language of Psalm 33, God spoke and it was done, He commanded and it stood fast, indicates that the creation was rapid.
Yes.
The expression, and it was so, when God creates, indicates that it took place quickly. The language of the fourth commandment, where God works 6 and rests the 7th, and then tells human beings that they're to work and rest the 7th,
Yes.
indicates that the days that we work and rest are the same as the days where God worked and rested. The New Testament authors make it clear that the days of creation were literal days. Ellen White confirms that the days of creation were literal days. And there are Adventist, non-Adventist scientists who also believe that the days of creation were literal days.
Yes.
We have abundant evidence that the days of creation were the same as the days that we know today. But sadly, even within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are those who are doubting whether the days of creation were literal days. When I went to pastor the church where I was for 21 years in Fresno, California, there was an associate pastor who was there. The senior pastor had left, and I took his place, but there was an associate pastor, young pastor. And I asked him one day, I said, what do you think about creation? You think the days of creation were literal days? And I was surprised by his answer. He says, well, no, I don't believe that they were 24-hour days. And he went on and he said, I believe that there was death long before sin in the animal world. And I said, how can you say that? He says, well, the geologic column proves beyond a shadow of doubt that there was death before sin and that the days of creation were millions of years long.
Come on.
You know what the geologic column is, right? He said that's proven that the days of creation were not literal days, they were millions of years. So then I looked at him and I said, what do you do with the Genesis account? And I gave him some of the reasons that we began with this evening why the days of creation were literal. And I was even more surprised when he said to me, don't get me wrong, I believe that the writer of Genesis believed that the days were literal. But science has proven that the writer of Genesis was wrong. And therefore, we must accommodate the biblical story to science.
What is saying, preacher?
This pastor, still a pastor. Ellen White wrote something very interesting about the tendency of some who believe in the creation story, but they try to accommodate it to science. Listen to this statement in the book Education, page 128 and 129.
Powerful book.
She wrote, inferences erroneously drawn from facts observed in nature have, however, led to a supposed conflict between science and revelation. And in an effort to restore harmony